So according to my machine, it's now streaming live on Facebook, Martin.
Perfect. I've just got that notice myself. Excellent.
So I
There
think
we
you've
are. So,
succeeded.
good.
Yes.
Perfect. So we are then live on Facebook and live on Zoom. And we're going to see then, we should just gonna see if I can get to the recording part here. So we're going to be recording this session. So I will start that very shortly. There we are. Okay. And so here we are. Not sure why I'm not showing. Can all of you hear me on Zoom and Facebook?
Yes.
That's all good? Perfect. So welcome then all of you, both here in Sigtuna. We're at the Sigtuna Foundation in Sigtuna, Sweden. And we're here today to listen to first Dr. Andrew Pinsent, who's joining us from, I believe, Oxford or possibly not Oxford.
Well, we're facing the same challenge as everyone else across the world. So I'm not at Oxford all the time, not today.
Right, very good. And so Andrew Pinsent is going to be talking today about truth, goodness and beauty. And we'll have a panel discussion following. Dr. Andrew Pinsent is the research director of the Ian Ramsay Center at Oxford University. He has a long list of academic credentials. He has an undergraduate and doctorate degree in physics, and also doctorate in philosophy, and he has several, well, at least one theology degree. I'm reading here off the list. I'm making sure I'm not missing any of them. And so he's worked both in physics and in philosophy and theology, and he's also a Catholic priest. So we're very delighted to have him talk to us today about truth, goodness, and beauty as sources of knowledge. And so please go ahead, Andrew.
Thank you very much. So the first thing I'm going to do is to try to share my screen. So let's see if I can share my screen. Host disabled attendee screen sharing. So we're going to have to sort that out, I'm afraid.
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you.
2 seconds. Where are you? Where were you? Ah, there we go. Okay, so you should now be able to do
okay,
that.
I'll try that now. Share screen. Okay, that's better. Let's see, this should work, hopefully. Share. I've got to go on access somehow, so one moment. We're connecting a lot of complicated systems together here. So Zoom. It says I'm now screen sharing, and you should see a PowerPoint slide now.
We do.
Yeah, that's great.
Success.
Wonderful. That's good news. Okay, so let me just see if I can see you again there. Oh, there you go. You've okay, got it. Right. So screen sharing, and you should see the title, Truth, Goodness, Beauty, Sources of Knowledge. Is everyone happy with that?
Yes.
Yes.
Good, great. So welcome today. I'll be grateful if someone lets me know how long I should speak for from now. 40 minutes? Is it 40 minutes? 45 minutes? Martin? 45 minutes. Okay, great.
Yep.
So I was given this title. These are big topics, by the way. Truth, goodness, and beauty. So I'll give it a go and see how we get on. But I wanted to begin by starting a story. And I'm going to finish the story at the end of my talk. If nothing else, hopefully you will remember the story. So have you ever heard of The Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen? Does anyone know The Snow Queen? I've got a few nods. This is good. So I read this story when I was 8 years old, and it haunted me. It fascinated me. 40 years later, I was reading a book on neuroscience in my Oxford office, and suddenly I understood the story of the Snow Queen. It hit me like a thunderbolt. So I shall begin the story, and I shall finish the story at the end of my talk. So in the story of the Snow Queen, there's a little boy called Kai, and he's caught splinters in his eyes and in his heart. And the splinters come from a mirror that is broken by an evil demon. And the splinters are floating through the Earth's atmosphere. And one splinter gets in his eye and one splinter gets in his heart. And these splinters change the way he looks at the world. From this point on, he admires only geometric beauty, only mathematical beauty, like snowflakes. He despises living and growing things. And he also ignores or despises his friend Gerda and his grandmother. And all this is set in a Scandinavian country. Maybe it's Sweden. And in this mood, it's during winter time, and he meets the Snow Queen. And he boasts to the Snow Queen of his rationalistic knowledge, his knowledge of numbers, his knowledge of counting, his knowledge of mathematics. And she carries him away to her palace or her castle, and she leaves him on a frozen lake, which is described as the mirror of reason. Kai is cold, but he doesn't know he's cold because the Snow Queen has kissed him, which has taken away all feeling from his body. And he's fascinated by rearranging blocks of ice, but he can never spell the word eternity, without which he cannot leave. So that's the situation of Kai and the Snow Queen, and I will finish the story at the end of my talk. Okay, as Martin was saying, I've got a mixed background. I spent 6 years in physics at Oxford, 7 years in scientific and business consultancy, 7 years training as a priest, 4 years of doctoral studies, back to Oxford theology faculty. So I'm still working out what I'm going to do when I grow up, but I'm a great believer in a mixed education in science and the humanities. I've been lucky enough to have one. Incidentally, the picture there is a readout from my experiment at CERN. And while I was there, the internet was invented. I remember the whole world suddenly adopting the World Wide Web, and it caught all the technical gurus out because they weren't expecting it. I remember Bill Gates saying the internet will never be important. He did say that, but it all started by accident, really, from the World Wide Web we were developing at CERN. So it's a little byproduct of our work that changed the world. I work back at Oxford, a very beautiful place, as Andrew Briggs will testify as well. I'll say a bit more about Oxford later, but I work in the Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religion. Now, what I want to do today is look first at truth, beauty, and goodness in a primitive, idealized world. Let's say a biological, covenantal world. And then I want to mention several revolutions that have taken place. And then I want to mention the prospects for truth, beauty, and goodness today. And then I will finish off by going back to the Snow Queen's castle. Okay, so I'll begin with truth, goodness, and beauty in a biological or covenantal world. Let me show you a picture of the founding parable of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the story of Eden. And this shows Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and they're just there in the background, reaching towards the fruit. Don't touch the fruit. Right? But you see there an idealized vision of nature in its beauty and its diversity. And this is the sort of idealized setting for beginning to talk about truth, beauty, and goodness. Now, in this paradisal state, truth, beauty, and goodness are pretty self-evident. And goodness is very diverse. I mean, the goodness of a parrot is different to the goodness of a tree, it's different to the goodness of a horse, but they can all flourish. And the extent to which they flourish is the extent of their goodness. And the philosophy drawn from this is classical philosophy, and Aristotle, and to some extent St. Thomas Aquinas. They look at living and growing things, and that's where they get their measure of what is goodness in a natural sense. Goodness is to do with the flourishing, the perfection of a living and growing thing. And there's one more dimension in the story of Eden, because the man and the woman are initially in a covenant with God. A covenant with God. This is a relationship which is like a spiritual marriage. In the Catholic faith, we call this the life of grace. And this covenant establishes another basis for goodness, which is a faithfulness to the covenant. God gives the man and woman only one positive law, which is to not eat the fruit of the trees in the center of the garden. So almost immediately, this is what they do, of course, and they break the covenant. And there's a special word for this called sin, and this is like spiritual adultery. And this brings shame and guilt, and they run away from God, and they get kicked out of paradise. So that's the story of Eden. Now, in this conception of the world, where one is using objects from nature, then goodness is rooted in the flourishing, in the fully developed form of the thing. And what fascinated the philosopher Aristotle, if you cut open a living thing, all the matter is directed towards the flourishing of the thing. And it's quite amazing. All the parts of a plant, for example, are directed towards the flourishing of the plant and the production of the fruit of the plant. And so this sets a standard for goodness in nature. We get here, we can draw from this ideas like natural law later on. And in one sense, we don't need philosophers to tell us what goodness is from this. We can just look at it. We can see, for example, a good apple and a bad apple. And the good apple is the fully developed, tasty form of the apple. And the bad apple is decayed and rotten and squidgy, and there are maggots eating it, and it's breaking down. So it's no difficult philosophical discussion needed. We have an image of goodness on one side and an image of rottenness on the other. So we draw from this the idea that goodness is defined by the fully developed form of a thing. And you might think this is pretty obvious, but the philosopher Aristotle took this model and he used it to develop the most important account of ethics that human beings have ever written, which is the Nicomachean Ethics, the most important classical treatment of what it means to flourish as a human being rather than an apple. Now, on this approach, evil or badness is parasitical and is defined relative to goodness. But there's one additional point to make here, because anything, whether good or bad, can still be an instrumental good or perhaps evil. So a good apple is good for us to eat. A bad apple is good for a maggot to eat, as we can see in this picture. So that's pretty straightforward, and this gives us some classical definitions of good and evil. So Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century defined goodness as follows: principally, therefore, a being capable of perfecting another after the manner of an end, by which we mean perfected form, is called good. And Augustine in the 5th century writes about evil. Evil has no positive nature. The loss of good has received the name evil. So that's a basic starting point for goodness and evil. Also want to mention that we say in classical philosophy that goodness and being are almost equivalent. And the classical philosophers used to divide up being into different categories. So substance, which is like the living and growing thing, and then all the things that can happen to substance. And Aristotle identified these 9 categories. And goodness and evil can extend across all 9 categories. So if Socrates is 2 meters tall, that's great. If he's 3 miles tall, he'll collapse under his own gravitational weight. And so that will be evil for Socrates. And you can also say, if Socrates was unjust, that will be evil. If he was a dictator's worst enemy, that will be evil. If he was in a dungeon, that would be evil. If he was late for class, that would be evil. If he was under siege, that would be evil. Or sick, evil. Or drinking hemlock, be evil. Or being executed, evil. So goodness and evil, we actually call goodness a transcendental because it transcends any of the categories of being. It goes, it can be found across all the categories of being. With regard to truth, there's a lot of philosophical discussion about truth, but it's good to have a simple working definition. Truth as correspondence is by far the easiest. So if I say this is a good apple, I've spoken the truth at the top, but I speak falsity if I say it's a good apple when it's a bad apple, or I say it's a bad apple when it's a good apple. So truth is a correspondence. That's the easiest way of defining truth, and that was the classical definition of Aristotle. Incidentally, a thing for you to think about, Jesus Christ says, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life." So you might want to think about this. In what sense is Jesus Christ a correspondence? And that's an interesting question for theology. Okay, so we've got a basic definition of goodness, got a basic definition of truth. And beauty is a bit of an extra one, really. Beauty is simply defined as goodness perceptible to the senses. Goodness perceptible to the senses. Traditionally, we call it a pseudo-transcendental. It behaves a bit like the transcendentals, but not quite. It's not wholly interchangeable with goodness. So beauty can be used by evil. Not everything that is good is also beautiful. An example from the 20th century, when the uniforms were being designed for the German soldiers in the 1930s, the Nazis had the soldiers parade in front of young women who would judge, who were asked to assess how handsome it made the soldiers look, how strong or handsome it made the soldiers look. So the Nazis understood the power of beauty to present, to like advertise themselves and advertise their strength to conquered peoples. So this is the point I make, that beauty can be used by evil. Not everything that is good is also beautiful. I don't know if you may know that the traditional term for Lucifer. Lucifer is a name for the devil, and Lucifer is also described as the bearer of light. So not everything that appears beautiful is necessarily good. So here's a basic definition: truth, classical understanding. So truth, conformity of a thing and one's understanding or one's words. Goodness, of being capable of perfecting another after the manner of an end, the perfected form of a thing. And beauty is goodness perceptible to the senses. So that's a basic working definition of truth, goodness, and beauty. Now, that's drawn from an idealized view of nature and a covenant with God. So that's the background. But since this time, we've been through several revolutions. I want to mention these revolutions briefly. One of them, of course, is we get kicked out of Eden. And as human beings, we tend to sin. We commit a lot of spiritual adultery against God. And this has an effect on us. this is a picture by Hieronymus Bosch, very famous. It's called The Garden of Earthly Delights. And on the left, you see a picture of covenant with God. So God walks with the man and the woman in the garden, and nature is about as perfect as it gets. There's still predation, so there are interesting issues there, but it's about as perfect as it gets. But then in the middle picture, they've lost the covenant. And from a distance, it looks like a party. As you get close, there's a lot of perversity going on in this image. And they're not going anywhere. But on the right-hand side, you see the consequence of that, a kind of hellscape of evil as a result. So what the artist is showing here, if we lose covenant, you see a gradual breakdown in society, a breakdown in the human person, and so on. Another revolution, but also some malign consequences, is associated with the scientific revolution. Now, this picture here, I'd love to ask you a question at this point, so you'll have to unmute. What does this picture look like? It should remind you of another kind of picture. It should remind you of a picture associated with a special celebration every year. Anyone like to have a go?
Christmas.
Christmas, yes. From a distance, it looks like a Christmas card, right? And you can imagine the baby Jesus in the middle, surrounded by the shepherds and Mary and Joseph and a light in the sky. But here, they're grouped around an 18th century scientific experiment in England. And it's quite an ambiguous picture. We are definitely making scientific progress. We are making vast improvements in measurement, in empirical studies of the world. But if you look carefully, you can see that there is a dove in a glass container, and the air is being pumped out of the container, and the dove will be killed. And the little girl and the woman in the foreground are turning away because this is the death of a living thing. And the man behind them is saying, toughen up, this is science, this is the future. So it's an interesting picture. It's quite ambiguous in terms of what it's doing. And obviously science has brought many benefits, but there's also, as we generally acknowledge, the issue of destruction of the natural world, and perhaps some breaking of covenant with God, because the dove is also a symbol of the Holy Spirit in Christianity. So it's something of an ambiguous picture here. And there are other revolutions. This is worth reading. It's not a comfortable reading. The unintended Reformation. The Reformation triggered a series of changes, many of which Martin Luther did not expect and did not want. But this has also brought about many changes in the world today, which we could talk about. And there's also a change in how we see space. So in this picture, this is from the 15th century. This is spiritual space. The size of the people, of the personal beings in this picture, is proportional to their holiness. So this is, if you like, spiritual space. There is, by the way, some use of perspective. You can see that in the earthly cities near the bottom of the picture. But the size is proportional to holiness. So this is like a spiritual space. In the mid-15th century, it's before Descartes, but you can call it the Cartesian revolution. Space is being seen geometrically, and the figure of Christ in the background is much smaller than the figures in the foreground. So everything is becoming relativized to an invisible box, the Cartesian box. And this will also have consequences to how we think about the world. And this changes architecture as well. So this is one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. And this is transcendent architecture. A lot of architecture at the University of Oxford is also like this. It points upwards. It points upwards. But a lot of architecture today doesn't point upwards. It's pragmatic. It is Cartesian. What is the main angle in this cityscape? What is the main angle? Well, hopefully you can still hear me. It's a right angle. Everything's 90 degrees. Everything is X, Y, and Z. I used to work there, by the way. This is the city of Sao Paulo in Brazil, but it could also be Beijing. It could also be New York, and everything's Cartesian. And sometimes we go a step further. So in Britain, after the Second World War, we had this new style of architecture called brutalism. This is not only ugly, it celebrates ugliness. And on the left is Trellick Tower in London. And this was designed by a man called Goldfinger. And the writer Ian Fleming had an argument with Goldfinger, and he took his revenge, and you can guess how. And on the other picture here, I'm ashamed to say, is a church building. It's a ruined seminary in Scotland. For some reason, they employed a brutalist architect, and now they can't get rid of it because the government of Scotland says you're not allowed to demolish it. But it's only loved by architects. It's not loved by the church or anyone else. So we have it's like a celebration of ugliness today. There was an attempt in England, has been an attempt to try to get more beautiful buildings, and there's clearly a bit of a battle going on. There was a man called Sir Roger Scruton, who died recently, and he was actually falsely accused of racism and actually lost his job for the Government Commission for Beautiful Buildings. So there's a kind of weird battle going on behind the scenes, because a lot of people like this stuff, but they want more of it. Okay, so how has truth, beauty, and goodness changed in a post-revolutionary world? With truth, we've moved much more to what is pragmatically correct, or what works. If it works, that's fine. Until very recently in science, we have kept a sense of transcendent truth, but I think we're losing that as well. I've heard an academic speak in public and say that she would support lying in order to achieve a good scientific goal, and so I sense there's a trend towards pragmatism rather than, if you like, a coherent or transcendent approach to truth. Goodness is problematic, and the problem there is that we've lost a sense of end-directed action in nature. The kind of systems that Sir Isaac Newton studied were two-body systems. They're the only ones we can integrate. And the problem with two-body systems is that there's no end-directed action. And because of, and we tend to, with this perspective, we tend to look at nature like a set of complicated machines. And machines do not have ends. And without ends, we're not sure how to establish a sense of goodness. The philosophers understand this, so they try to promote substitutes. Immanuel Kant promoted equality, but equality is only a partial substitute, because you can have the equality of death, you can have the equality of ugliness. That doesn't make these things good in themselves. Beauty, you can't eradicate beauty because it's built into us, so goodness perceptible to the senses. But often people's sense of beauty is somewhat lost, or they're even taught that they have to think of ugliness as beautiful. So there can be a bit of confusion there. And I want to show you the revolution in art. So this is a perception of human happiness in the 15th century, and it's drawn from the book of Revelation. And you can see there an image of the Lamb of God, Jesus Christ, incarnate at the center of the image, surrounded by angels, surrounded by saints, and in a renovated nature, a nature healed of its natural evils. So that's an image of success in the 15th century. In the 16th century, there's a change. So if you look from here to here, you'll see that the saints are getting smaller. This is a picture of Saint Jerome, with the penitence of Saint Jerome in the middle. But the focus of the picture is switching to nature alone, not grace implanted in nature, which is this picture. So we're losing the saints, we're losing the Christian symbols. By the late 16th century, I don't know if you can see the church there. There is a church, but it's hidden behind the tree in the background of the picture. So there's been a retreat of the concretely given supernatural. We're now looking almost exclusively at nature. And by the 19th century, this is the height of English landscape painting, Constable the Hayway, and it's very beautiful. There's a sense of spirituality there, but it's very significant what is missing compared to a few centuries previously. There are no churches, there are no sacraments, there are no saints, there's no crucifix. There's not the Christian understanding of the concretely given supernatural, which inspired art for 1,000 years. And what happens next? This is the last picture of Vincent van Gogh before he committed suicide. The vertical dimension is shrinking, and the road in the center isn't going anywhere. And there's a loss of coherence in nature as well, our perception of nature. And this is Pollock in 1947. I think this picture is called Enchanted Forest. Yes, Enchanted Forest. I won't ask you to make an aesthetic judgment, but clearly there is a change. As our theology has changed as a society, our art has changed as well, and we're starting to lose coherence even in our sense of nature. So that's the situation today. Many revolutions, a certain fragmentation and confusion about notions of goodness, beauty, and truth. Now, I want to finish by looking at prospects for truth, goodness, and beauty in the modern world. And we are indeed living in a brave new world. I'm very grateful for many of the benefits of the modern world. Of course, we are richer, we live longer than any other people in human history. We have many benefits, and people look at this as a brave new world. This was I didn't know that Iron Maiden still existed. They were big when I was a teenager, but apparently they're still alive. Old hard rock groups never die. So there's an image of a rather evil face looking down at a modern city. But the earthly paradise is fragile. This was Dresden in 1945 after a visit by the Royal Air Force. So even in fighting the Nazis, we had to cause a lot of damage to a lot of beautiful cities. And in this brave new world, one of the biggest challenges, probably the biggest single challenge, is endless distractions. I mentioned, if those of you who heard my talk yesterday, I mentioned Plato's Cave, and I went to Hollywood 8 years ago. I sat on the set of Friends, famous American TV sitcom Friends, and I thought, I'm back in Plato's Cave, where we see the shadows of the puppets of real things. And for many of our population, the shadows of the puppets of real things take up all their time. And Aldous Huxley's Brave New World predicted this. And he predicted a world in which people are continuously distracted and never think about deep issues. And right at the end of the Brave New World, the people involved in the story meet one of the controllers of the Brave New World. A man who, by the way, was offered the chance to become a physicist or else become a controller of the Brave New World. He chose power. He chose to become a controller. He has some interesting things to say. He says, he's asked, do you think there's no God? And he says, no, I think there quite probably is a God, but we're not interested. We block out God, we keep people busy, and we lock up anything that could encourage people to think about God. And of course, even with all the benefits of the modern world, time draws to a close for all of us. We only have a finite time. We have not solved, and probably cannot solve, the problem of immortality in a good way. So what is to be done? Now, I would say that human nature has not changed appreciably in 2,000 years, or maybe 200,000 years. We still hunger for beauty, and in a qualified way at least, for goodness and truth, or at least authenticity. And moreover, we have access to the same spiritual resources as the great saints of the past. In fact, we have easier access to intellectual and financial resources. So actually, I don't think anything is impossible, or rather, anything is possible. A single holy life can transform the world over countless generations. Now, I only have about 10 minutes, so I'll just give you a couple of examples. But I want to mention a Swedish saint, Saint Bridget of Sweden. I hope you've heard of Saint Bridget of Sweden, all you modern Swedes. But she's an amazing woman. So she lived in the 14th century. She was the daughter of a rich landowner. She was married at 14 years old, and she bore 8 children. She was renowned for her works of charity, particularly towards the region's unwed mothers and their children. After the death of her husband, she became a kind of religious. She was a member of the Third Order of St. Francis of Assisi. She established a religious order, which were later called the Brigittines, and she urged reform of the church, and she died in Rome. And the order was revitalized in the 20th century by another Swedish saint, Elizabeth Hasselblad. Elizabeth Hasselblad is not just a Catholic saint, but the Jews honor her as one of the righteous among the Gentiles, because the house of the Brigittines in Rome was used to shelter up to 60 Jews during the Nazi occupation of Rome. So she is honored by the Catholic Church as a saint, and by the Jewish people as one of the righteous among the Gentiles. So, but the point is this woman in Sweden in the 14th century, she still has an impact on the world. It's amazing. And the people who followed her have an impact on the world. And I wanted to give you an example here that's more close to home in England. So we have Brigittine nuns in Birmingham, which is our biggest industrial city in England. And right in the middle, there is a religious house, and we've got Brigittine nuns living there. And just for fun, I'll show you this. This is a Brigittine nun, a small version. And this was given to my mother by the nuns of the Brigittine house in Birmingham. So I'm very grateful for this. So this is a little consequence of the life of Saint Bridget of Sweden. But the point is this: one life, one holy life, 600 years ago, is still having an impact on the world today. So that's why, if you ask me what is to be done, I don't have any plan, but I do know that one life can change the world, and it's amazing. Here's another example I want to give you. This is Antoni Gaudi and the Sagrada Familia. I hope you've heard of Antoni Gaudi. He was a famous architect in the 19th century in Spain, in actually the Catalan region of Spain. And he had an idea for an amazing church. He took his whole life working on the design. He only finished 10% of the church before he died, I think in 1924. And this is called the Sagrada Familia. He only finished 10% of the church, but he said, my client is not in a hurry. So don't worry, it'll be finished. It'll be finished. And we've been building his church for 100 years since then. it is amazingly beautiful. It is unique. There is no church like it in the world. It blends Gothic and Art Deco and a whole host of other things together. We need a lot of modern architectural technology to finish it, computer-aided design and so on. And people are still working on it, and it's changing people's lives. I've listened to a lot of talks by people working on this church. It's become their whole life to finish this church, and it is absolutely beautiful. So there is no question to me that beauty is somehow impossible today. No, we can produce beauty. What we need are transformed lives, and there is no limit to what is possible. Okay, so I've got about 3 or 4 minutes, so I want to finish off by going back to the Snow Queen's castle. If you remember at the beginning, the story of the Snow Queen, and the little boy is trapped in the castle. But fortunately, he has a friend called Gerda, and Gerda does not give up on him, and she goes to rescue him. And she has many adventures, but eventually she finds the Snow Queen's castle, and she enters the castle to try to find Kai. Now, I want to ask you a question, so you have to unmute yourselves again. Which philosopher died of the cold in Sweden, involved with a Swedish queen? So which philosopher died of the cold in Sweden, involved with a Swedish queen? Descartes. It took me 40 years to figure that one out. And so I heard the story when I was 8, and then suddenly, bang, it hit me. This is a parable of Descartes and a kind of warning about Cartesianism, which forms a lot of the way we think about the world, the way we like to represent the world, that is typical in a scientific context. And the little girl Gerda, she goes to search for Kai, who's imprisoned in the Snow Queen's castle. And after enduring many dangers, she finds him in the palace, and she embraces him, but his heart is cold. He doesn't respond. You have to remember, he's lost any sense of living and growing things, and he's lost relationships with his former playmate and with his grandmother. So he's abandoned relationships, and he has no respect for living and growing things. And eventually, Gerda cries over him, and the tears melt the splinter in his eye and his heart. He suddenly recognizes her. The puzzle solves itself. He spells the word eternity, and he walks out of the palace with her. So, unlike in the story of Descartes, in the story of the Snow Queen, the little girl finds Kai and she rescues him. He's trapped in these cold representations of the world, and he's able to see once again the bigger world. So there's many of a story illustrated many times. Disney stole this story, by the way, made it into a bad film called Frozen, which has nothing to do with the genius of Hans Christian Andersen. I do recommend the original story. And this is just like a conversion experience. So if you remember the story of St. Paul is it's a kind of a son of Bin Laden, really, of the Acts of the Apostles, and he's going off to kill Christians in Damascus, which sometimes happens today. And as he's traveling off to Damascus, this light shines around him, and a voice is heard, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And he said, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you'll be told what you are to do." So the experience of Kai and the Snow Queen is a bit like the experience of Saul, who we later know as St. Paul, whose conversion changes the world. And sometimes this conversion, this kind of transformation is more subtle. I included here an example from a work of fiction, C.S. Lewis, That Hideous Strength. But there's a description of of a conversion, which is also triggers a revolution in someone's life. So there's one of many pictures of St. Paul with the mythical horse. And if those of us working in universities, part of our job is to accompany our students and to help trigger their understanding of the world, to help them to be responsive to truth and to beauty and to goodness. So the warning of the Snow Queen. I must begin just to finish off. I must begin by saying I love science. I have been a scientist for many years, but we must be careful not to restrict our view of reality to just what is possible with the scientific method, because that's only part of reality, the stuff we can integrate. And the Snow Queen, what it illustrates is closure to insights. The little boy is trapped with nothing but frozen representation of the world. And he boasts of his Cartesian knowledge, his geometric knowledge, but he can't fit things together properly. And the girl who rescues him, who also represents the Holy Spirit, her tears melt the evil splinters in his eye and his heart. And it illustrates the role of covenant in escaping the trap. So for our generation, we should use, thankfully, the tools of science and the Cartesian representations, but the world is bigger than that, and we mustn't turn those into a god. And in a life that's covenantal to God, that will also generate rich and innovative insights into the nature of the created world. So I'll finish off with just a nice picture to leave you with. My favorite painting, actually, a vision of heaven with God, to which God calls us in the gospel. And John tells us in his letter, beloved, we are God's children now. It does not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he appears, we shall be like him. We shall see him as he is. Well, thank you. I've spoken for 45 minutes. I shall finish there. I hope there's something interesting there for you to reflect on and for us to discuss in our discussion panel. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. So we will just switch over a little bit briefly here for the panel discussion. So hold on for a second.
Okay.
Okay, so I think we are just about ready to go. Okay, so we will now have a panel discussion to discuss what was covered in this talk, and we'll get into these topics then. So the format here is going to be about a few minutes introduction from the panelists, and then we're going to have a discussion about a few questions, and let's see where we go. And then towards the end, there will be an opportunity for people in the room and people who are joining via Zoom to post questions, well, either here in the room or on the chat in Zoom. So if you have a question on Zoom, please notify in the chat that you want to ask a question. So let me first start by introducing the panelists. So first we've got Petra Carlsson. Do you want to say hi, Petra? Let's see if we can see you.
Hi, can you also hear
now
me?
we can see you. Yes, perfect. There we are. So Petra Carlsson is a docent and lecturer in systematic theology at, you have to, Enskilda högskolan in Stockholm. And in English, I'm not sure, it's the University College Stockholm?
And we're actually still called Stockholm School of Theology also, my department is. So that's where I'm at. Stockholm University College, also called in English, yeah.
Okay. And we also have Josefin Holmström, who has a PhD in American literature and may well be known to you as an author and writer. Do you want to say anything more about?
Yes, well, I'm a writer. I did my undergraduate degree in Oxford and my PhD in Cambridge, and now I'm back in Sweden. But so it is very wonderful to hear these academic Oxford voices again. But yes, I write about Christianity and literature.
Thank you. And also we have Paul Hemeren, who is here with us in Sigtuna. And Paul is docent, I think, or lecturer in cognitive science at Högskolan i Skövde, and also head of department of informatics. Is that correct? Yes. So you're joining us from here, and so I hope we're going to have an interesting discussion. And so I thought we'll start with some introductions from the panelists. So let me invite Petra to start for a few minutes with your reflections on Andrew's talk.
Yes, and first, thank you so much, Andrew. That was lovely. You spoke to all the senses at once. So I really loved listening to your talk. I wanted to add, after hearing you, I think another frozen lake, the risk of another frozen lake,
Yes.
Mirror of Christian faith. I'm taking the odd position here, since I'm an ordained minister myself, and also a scholar of theology. But as you and I, and probably many more in the room know, early on in Christianity, there were two big thought traditions that met. And that was the Hellenistic thought world and the Hebraic, so Jewish thought and Hellenistic thought. And in Augustine, for example, you can see this when he had read Neoplatonism, and it all made sense to him. The one, which is then the truth, the perfection beyond everything, the source of everything we see, which relates to the Logos, which is like the one, the sun. The sunbeams, the Logos, our rationality, our longing for understanding, and then the human soul, which is the moon that wouldn't be lit up without the sun, or the sunbeams. So he had this system of thought when he started reading the letter of Paul.
Yes.
Paul's letter to the Romans, and so it all made sense to him. And it was like, oh, now I see clearly the sun, the one in Plotinus' understanding is the Christian God, and the Logos, the Word, is Christ, and so my soul won't find peace until I rest in Him, and so on and so forth. And so this, and then this, the merge between philosophy, what we today see as philosophy and theology, continued through the history of Christianity. And in Anselm of Canterbury, we see this idea of, well, the truth the highest good, it must exist. Since nothing in this world is perfect, nothing that we see or experience is perfect, but still we do have an idea about what perfection is. Okay, so then just from that fact, we have to acknowledge that there must be such a thing as perfection, that truth must exist. Once you have said the good, do not add one more thought, because when you have done so, you have left the sphere of the good and you've entered into the human sphere of imperfection.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I just find that beautiful, and I still think those kind of categories, the good, the true, the beautiful, are active in our ways of thinking today. But what happened then, of course, which I think Anselm already knew, was that people have a hard time not adding another thought when thinking the good, the true, the beautiful. And people of power within the church or outside the church have a hard time not adding themselves when thinking the good, the true, the beautiful. And so we see through the history of Christianity, and also today, people, well, like Donald Trump for talking, I feel bad talking, I know he has a, I know he has a fever, so I shouldn't talk badly about him today. But anyway, using the imagery of the chosen one, the elected few, and kind of borrowing those biblical images of the true, the good, the beautiful. We've also had a documentary that many Swedes have been watching this summer on a little Pentecostal congregation in a village quite close to where you are, actually, in Sigtuna, called Knutby, where this idea of the elected few who were actually able to build the little congregation where the good, the true, the beautiful would actually conquer. And they wanted to spread this to the world. And I truly think that they did want to do so. But what they ended up with was women abuse and dreadful murders and, well, just a horrific way of living together, because they kind of lifted themselves, added themselves to the idea of the truth and the good. So that is just my way of saying there are also dangers in these concepts, which then could be kind of the frozen lake of the idea of a Christian truth that you can actually access. Yeah, so just adding another angle.
I agree.
Thank you very much. So we'll pass it over to Josefin.
Thank you. Yes, I'm sort of following on. First of all, thank you so much, Andrew. I thought that was absolutely wonderful and a blessing to hear. I'm very attracted to the idea of the truth, and I think that it is in itself not quite as dangerous as perhaps Petra. I see what you mean, but I'm not quite sure I agree. I was very struck by what you said about truth, goodness, and beauty in the post-revolutionary world, Andrew, and also connecting this with Van Gogh's painting, where the road is leading nowhere, yes. Which means that all these things we're looking at are no longer transcendent; they are just temporary, and they get us nowhere.
Yes.
And this, I think, is probably one of the biggest problems in our current culture. We're all created in the image of God, and even if we don't believe, we have that inside of us, and so we still seek these things. But I see a culture that is progressively alienated from any connection to anything higher, and this will always lead to a distortion and a perversion of that which is good, true, and beautiful. And that, I think, is probably one of the most important things that the Christian church and the individual Christian has to give to the world today, is to restore the true meaning of the true, the good, and the beautiful. And that is what struck me most about your talk here, that kind of, because the Cartesian worldview is not just about nature, it's about the whole way we view each other as instrumental or as just pure function. And I see this in the story as well, looking at other humans as less than created in the image of God. And this is when we use and abuse each other. So I would say that is for me a huge task that church has got in today's society. So thank you for that.
There's an English Anglican author, C.S. Lewis, and C.S. Lewis, the title of one of his books is Till We Have Faces.
Oh, I love that one.
Faces. Oh, good. But the idea of the face-to-face connection with other people, and even with God. And that's the Christian revolution. This helps us stop us becoming like the frozen snow queen or alienated in our cultures. But it's certainly it's a strong challenge today. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. So then I'll pass it over to Paul, please.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Is this all right?
Yes,
Okay.
I can hear Paul.
So, I mean, my perspective is from a cognitive science.
Yes.
And I appreciate all of the examples that you gave, Andrew. I mean, it's very moving in the sense that we experience things. I mean, there are senses of qualia in this, our experience. And one of the major questions or issues that I've been working on has to do with what is the role of feelings and emotions and facts in communication and decision making? I mean, it's important to know that cognitive science research has shown that factual knowledge alone is not as convincing as factual knowledge that is communicated in relation to feelings.
Yes.
That are associated with the communication of facts. So this is our main challenge, I think, is understanding how do we communicate with others? What do we use? So if I go into my experience as a Christian, but I'm talking to someone who isn't a Christian, I have to realize that there's a gap there. And how do I handle that gap? If it's a scientist who has certain knowledge within an area, maybe I can make that connection if I'm also there as well, and use the relationship, this face-to-face connection, as a way of allowing this person to try to understand my feelings and my experiences as a Christian, and understand that, oh, there's a much larger perspective to understand the facts of life. So from a cognitive science perspective, the view is, okay, how do we convey truth? How do we convey our facts? How do we communicate them? And the idea of using our experiences.
If I may just comment briefly on that, I read a book about neuroscience called The Master and His Emissary: The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. You may or may not agree with the book, but what the book emphasized was the importance of the right brain hemisphere, which the author associates with the role of metaphor and narrative. So you asked about how to communicate. Stories are much more powerful than facts or abstracted dogmas. And all effective communicators tell stories. As a teenager, I wondered, why did Jesus tell so many stories? Why does he just tell us the conclusions? You know, it seems inefficient. Forgive me, Lord. But I now know that's the best way of communicating. You have to tell a story. I've given you a story today, the story of the Snow Queen. So if you forget everything else I said, you can at least remember the Snow Queen. So I think good neuroscience can actually reinforce traditional wisdom about these things, because we tended to forget to some extent the importance of stories, of pictures, of experience. You mentioned qualia, not just representations or model building of the world. So these things are meant to work together.
I can also mention just one, there's another book, it's called The Influential Mind by Tali Shiro.
Oh, right.
Who's the neuroscientist, a very famous scientist. And she's written this very good book about how do we influence people? How do we make decisions? How does our communication actually work?
Yes.
Very good book.
But I mentioned yesterday in my talk the lectures by Jordan Peterson on Genesis. And I've been amazed because he has millions of people watching these lectures, and he's not writing explicitly from a Christian perspective, but he's just unpacking the stories and their significance for human needs. and it's absolutely amazing. So I think with Christianity, it takes genius to make it dull, insipid, and boring. There is so much that is so amazing in all our stories, in our effect on civilization, in our effects on so many fields. I could tell you stories about Christianity and brewing, or Christianity and architecture, or Christianity and art. As I said, it takes genius to make it boring. So if people say today, people don't listen to the gospel, well, learn, get cultured, understand the world that we live in, because so much of it is a product or a fruit of the faith in one way or another. And that is interesting, even if you're an atheist, I would have thought.
Very good. Okay. Thank you. Did you want to add anything to this? Okay, thank you. So I think we'll move on. So I'm when listening to you now, it seems that a common theme that comes up is connection, communication, stories, metaphors, and in a sense then what are perhaps conducive or good metaphors, both in the sense of perhaps being good representations of something, but also good in the moral sense, let's say. So I would invite you, maybe start with Petra then, to if you have any thoughts on how should we think about how to construct or represent good stories, and what can they do for us in this respect and in the context of what we're talking about?
I think many writers know, looking at Josephine now, but she can't see me that I'm looking, but many writers know that a key one key to a good story is to use all the senses. You have to be able to hear, smell, and feel, sense the moment, usually with just minor details that we as readers hardly even notice, but they are placed there in order to put us in a concrete situation. And that brings me to what I thought about when I heard the discussion now, and that is the fact that there is, and also connected to what I just said earlier, but that in philosophy, you have the systems for thought. But what Augustine found in Christianity was a system also for life and for everyday life. Christianity is also a way of living. And I think that also is a part of the story you tell, the Snow Queen. I mean, one aspect of that is of the Gerda coming into rescuing Kai is also that she's still, he's her friend, and it's just, and that's just it, it's and that won't go away because they've done things together and they've, had cookies together. I don't know, but it's just kind of the everydayness also is an important aspect of Christianity, which is also there, of course, in the liturgy, but also in just the fact that, and as you said, Jesus could have written just a book with like a logical kind of a Wittgensteinian kind of thing, but he didn't. So, and that was also to add kind of the smells, the sounds, the senses. So, and which is also, I guess, there in what Paul said about scientific facts. If they are not, if they're not presented in a proper setting, I won't believe them, because I need to smell the kind of scientific authority. So, and I think that we should be open to that and acknowledge that. I think that there is a wisdom in Christianity in that sense, that there is beauty in everyday life. There is beauty in that sense also in imperfection, which is not there in the Platonic or Hellenistic worldview in that sense. Yeah, so sorry, I could talk forever. I find this very interesting.
Thank you. I'll pass it on to Josefin then, please.
No, I think as an author, I am always committed to the idea of truth. And truth, even though I write fiction, I write other things, but I do write fiction, but it still has to be true. And I think one of the greatest things about that is the honesty that we see in the stories in the gospel. Jesus is very aware of the nature of mankind, and he tells stories that are quite unflinching about what humanity is like. And that is another thing that I think in Christianity sometimes we still have this desire to hide our faces from each other, to hide ourselves and to hide what we are and who we are when we struggle with something. But part of the story of the Christian gospel is that honesty. And that needs to be in the story, the idea that everything is not easy, or that the Christian life is quite a struggle sometimes. So these are things I think about when I think about truth in the context of story, and that is, the reader of a book knows if it's dishonest, if it's not true, if there's something that the author is trying to hide. And I think when we communicate with people who don't yet believe, they will also tell if we are skipping over something, or they will tell if we're not being honest. And I think that's an intrinsic part of beauty as well, is that naked face, you know, to be known even as, to know even as I am known, and so forth.
Thank you. Paul?
Yeah, I mean, this notion of truth is very important as well, and that has to be the basis, the kind of solid context for what we do as humans. I mean, we're interested in reality. We want to know what's happening. We're concerned about our own lives and the people around us as well. One of the things, I mean, providing this larger context, I mean, if I look at it from a scientific kind of cognitive perspective, what I do perceptually in the work is I'll present information to people that's very low level kind of things, moving or just very low level features of an object. And I try to get them to identify it. Can they understand what this object is? And sometimes they can, but many times they can't. But as soon as I give them information, semantic information about a larger context, they can look at this detailed and they'll know right away what it is. And so I use that as an analogy in this idea of Jesus and Christianity for providing us with a context to understand the details of our lives.
Okay, thanks. So truth clearly is an important feature of stories then in this context, I can hear you all saying. Now, one can then ask, okay, but one aspect that came up here was in the talk, and I think a little bit in the discussion, the idea of a disconnect from a transcendent. And so I will finish with this question, and then we'll move to general questions. In view of this, and in view of the idea of conveying truth in stories we tell and in the communications and connections we have, I wonder, how can we envision communication, connection in a context which does not share the idea of some kind of transcendent realm or transcendent values even. Petra, what would you say to this? Petra, do we have you? I think you need to unmute, yes.
Sorry. Yeah, I think I would think along the lines of connectedness as a kind of basis for Christianity, or for a life in faith. It begins with relationality. I mean, that's at the very basis of the idea of the immanent and the transcendent, that there is some kind of connection, although there really shouldn't be one, or wouldn't, you know. But the idea of the connection, the relationality, I think that also gives us a hint of the way we could start talking about the transcendent reality. And I think it has to do really with presence and with actually listening, rather than holding on to the completely abstract ideas of truth, beauty, because they probably aren't completely abstract anyway, because they are our creations, since we're only human when we think them. And our ideas of the transcendent one is probably also kind of the Petra one kind of thing. But if I go into the actual presence of the relationship, when I'm talking to someone, or you know, when I'm talking to God or whatever, and actually being there, and also then leaving behind my ideas of how it should be, or how it should feel, you know, and my ideas of the perfect kind of prayer or whatever. Then I think I may get closer to the possibility of communicating my experience of transcendence. Yeah. So in a way, leaving the idea of transcendence in order to be able to communicate, or at least some ideas of transcendence.
Okay, and Josefin, would you like to?
Well, I'm not sure how much I can add, because I think Petra said it very, very well. I think, you know, God is a relational being. We have in the Trinity the Father and the Son in the Spirit in eternal communion with each other, and that's the basis and model of everything we do as humans. And just remembering that and being present with whoever we speak with, just like Petra says, I think that is the key, because humans, I think, will instinctively grasp something of that. Like almost everyone, even atheists, agnostics, will tell you that at some point in their life they've felt the urge to pray. And sometimes they have. It's not unusual to talk to people who say, well, I don't believe in God, but I did pray this one time. So there is that like awareness of a relational being out there somewhere. And if we bring that out, so much will be given from that, I think. It really is inside us. God has formed us for ourselves. This has come up before, you know, Augustine. So I would agree with Petra and say that.
Right, thank you. And Paul?
Yeah, agree, and I'm along the same lines. Let me just mention a concept, though, that I don't think we've mentioned yet here, that I think is very critical, and that's love. I mean, that is the relationship that we have with God, and that's the relationships that we have. That's the relationship that we have with one another, and that, to me, that's wow. That's fantastic. If we could love one another the way that Christ loves us, and if we can show that in whatever context we're in, I think that's would be the best thing we can do.
Thanks, Paul. Andrew, would you like to offer any final thoughts before we move to questions?
This idea Josephine mentioned about the face, I think is absolutely essential. And one of the novelties in the Judeo-Christian tradition was the very strong emphasis on truth. And because most cultures have a more pragmatic approach to truth. You know, most time the truth or occasionally a lie. That's like the modern conception. But I remember when I was teaching philosophy in the United States, and most of my students were relativists, of course. That's a natural state of an American teenager today. But they didn't like being betrayed in their relationships. That was like a moral absolute. And they also agreed that you can't be friends with a liar. You can't really be properly friends with a liar. So truthfulness and friendship go very closely together, and a deep friendship go close together. And that also ties to the comment about love, because Aquinas says love is best described as friendship in the end. So all these things are interrelated. And if we lose our covenant with God, or our sense of covenant with one another, then all these things begin to become, if you like, orphaned. And the risk is gradually they disintegrate in our society, even to the point where when you phone a company says your call is very important to us. This is a lie. This is more than a lie. There's a special word for it. I won't repeat the word. It's rude. But this is more than a lie. This is just words being used as a tool to make you feel slightly happy and stay on the line. So there's a lot of use of language for purely pragmatical purposes, not for covenant. Oh, can I mention one more thing about faces? The carnival in Venice. Carnival in Venice, they have a lot of masks. And if you think about it, people at a carnival want to behave badly. So how do? They put a mask on, which departicularizes the face. This is not you, this is a you. that changes the whole moral environment where people put a sort of mask on. So it's very important. It's a very important factor in morality. Oh, if I can't, can I say one more thing?
Go ahead.
In Genesis, the first question God asks Adam and Eve after they take the apple. Can anyone remember the first question? The first question that God asks. The first question is, where are you? Which, if you're God, I mean, that's a silly question, isn't it? Because they know God knows where everything is, right? But God is obviously referring to the loss of the relationship I and thou because of sin.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. So I think we have about 10 minutes maybe for questions. And so we're going to do in the room and on Zoom. So if you want to ask a question on Zoom, please write your question in the chat, and you can write it to everyone, please, so that all can see it. People will select some of the questions. Your question might not, there may not be time, perhaps. And also, if you have a specific panelist that you'd like to direct a question to, please indicate that. But I think we'll start to see whether we have any questions in the room. Questions? Well, we can start with a question from Zoom, perhaps. Then, so I will ask Patrick whether we have a question. Okay.
Should I read it or should
So okay, so let me see actually whether we can. I will do this. Maybe I can actually read it myself, seems. Yeah, I think I can read it. So there's a question here, and the question is, our very human nature propels us in every aspect of life, thanks to be created in the image of God. However, the same instinct also has the potential to distance us from a God, as exemplified in how the arts evolved. So the question says, this I see one of the main challenges in our lives, to maintain the mirroring of God in our lives rather than wanting to be a God, I suppose. What do you think on how researchers in particular could approach this difficulty, especially since we are researchers supposed to be pursuing truth? Do we have any one of the panelists that would like to comment on this? Maybe I'll ask you, Andrew, then to comment on this first.
Well, I'm going to say something very dangerous, because I'm going to say how important humility is. And in fact, I've written quite a lot on humility, but this is not the sort of thing I should boast about. But humility, you see, in the story of the Snow Queen, the boy doesn't want what is good, but he does not resist. And the big challenge we face cognitively is when our ideas get transformed, like St. Paul on the road to Damascus. And the challenge is, how do we get into a state where we want to accept the new insight? And my supervisor in America has a form of words for this. You must cease to resist. You must cease to resist. We don't begin by wanting what is good. We don't begin by wanting even intellectual growth often, because it's painful. We have to let go of what we already know and make an advance, like a kind of revolution of the mind. But we can at least cease to resist and be ready to accept the gift from someone else. So we talked about love earlier. The other great virtue of heaven is humility, and the great and extraordinary Christian revelation about God is not the power of God, but the humility of God. That's really unexpected for human beings, and all the attempts to create our own gods fail with this because it's totally unexpected and counterintuitive.
Thank you, Andrew. Petra, would you like to add your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I'm thinking that it's a very relevant and good question asked. Also because the churches that are growing the most today worldwide are charismatic and evangelical and Pentecostal churches, which in many ways is a good thing. But there is also this in the thought tradition, the theological tradition that these churches are standing in. There is the idea of the opposition between the church and the world made very distinctively and clearly, which I think often tends also to lead into a context where you regard yourself as that you should be better than the world, and that where living in the image of God, in the image of Christ, also can become a temptation into also thinking that you are a bit better. That leads away from the kind of humility that Andrew is pointing to, the Christian humility, which I also see as a good Christian virtue, and also, of course, with the idea of self-hatred due to the imperfection of the self, which can also lead to destructive behaviors in that sense. So I think there's a clear danger in parts of theology in that sense, and that one can be also a bit attentive to what kind of theological dogmas one enhances in the context, because humility also has, of course, to do with accepting the imperfection of one's own setting and one's own self and so forth.
Right. Thank you very much. Paul, Josefin, would you like to add anything to this?
No, we can see is there another question? Or...
Yeah, sure. We can go for another question. So I think we can actually try to continue this topic of humility, because we had a question from Ulf Jonsson, and I will make him co-host now just to make sure. So Ulf, if you can hear me, please go ahead and ask make your comment that you wanted to offer.
Thank you very much. Actually, I had a thought about this topic of humility, because I think that these transcendentals, the good and the true and the beautiful and so, they are all connected to each other, and they are absolute in a way, but there are tricky ways of going to the absolute, and what is necessary to have have this absolute, it is humility, because I think that the problem that you, Petra, for instance, mentioned with this absolute in an abstract way is that they are made by us. And that's the problem. It's not that there is something bad with truth or goodness or so, obviously not. But if they are only made by us, then they become problematic. So, and this is...
I think we lost you for a moment.
Okay.
If you could go back 1 or 2 sentences, sorry.
Okay. The problem with the false absolute is that they are made by us. But there is nothing bad with the truth. But on the contrary, it is very desirable with truth. But a truth that is simply made by us can be problematic. And so what we need is the humility to accept that we are created, we are finite. So, and we strive for something that is basically a gift. So the absolute is a gift, It's not something that we produce. I think this is very, very Christian, because we are created. We are not our own creator. And so the absolute that we talk about when we talk about the truth and the goodness, it is basically a gift. And then they are pure, and they are not frozen, and they are not being perverted, like, I mean, in perverted forms of religion and so on. I think humility is really a very important aspect.
Thank you. Indeed. Do we have a response to this? Andrew, would you like to add anything to this?
No. Perhaps you could maybe just very briefly. Let's touch on the issue of idolatry. If we make our own truth, it's like making an idol, and this is always the challenge of one of the many challenges of the spiritual life, because we can easily create a safe replica of God with more manageable characteristics, and again, the humility helps us, stops us from being closed off to that. Of course, the question then is, how do we become humble? So if you found a book saying teach yourself humility, probably this is not a good book to buy, because one of the catch-22, one of the paradoxes of humility, you can't make yourself humble. But God is gracious. God gives us humiliation. Humiliation. He will give us the gift of humility. It's just not very pleasant. It's just not very pleasant. But God will sort it out.
Right. I think we have a question from the room. But before we go to or did you want to comment on this? No. So before we go to that, I'll just ask if Paul or Josefin would like to make any addition on humility.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking of this. I mean, this triggered this previous topic that we had on openness and dialogue. And for me, I mean, this is what humility is, and it's having dialogue with others and being open for other points of view, to the extent that we can be challenged by what others have to say, and we can learn more from them as well. So it's that kind of openness and dialogue with the security that we're loved by God, that we can have contact with others and possibly avoid this kind of false truth situation that I think can actually occur and has occurred because of this lack of openness and dialogue with others.
Thank you. Indeed. Do we have a question?
Yeah.
Brief question? Yeah. I think it's good if you want to come here. Yeah. Actually, it's probably easiest.
Okay. So
here.
You hear me now, or? Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much for the talk and the conversation. I'm going a bit beyond my comfort zone asking this question, because these are not my this is not my area, so to speak. Obviously, I hope I have something to do with truth, beauty, and goodness at some point in my life. But anyway, you understand what I mean, the theoretical reflection. Anyway, so it seems to me that there's sometimes a sort of connection between, or I mean, resistance to notions of truth, beauty, and goodness could be somehow, sometimes perhaps understood in terms of a lack of hope that there is such a thing to be attained in the world. And if someone affirms truth, beauty, and goodness, you're sort of reminded of a loss, which can be a bit painful. So there's the melancholy that is triggered by an encounter with beauty. It's easier to be, it's like this saying from somewhere, it's the hope I can't stand. Despair is over the hope I can't. So, and there is a tension, obviously, in this world, because there is a lot of fragility, and there's a lot of suffering in this world. And I was this week reading a book about the notion of the image of God in the Genesis, and compared it to Mesopotamian perspectives, where the king is the image of God. And there was this saying that the slave is, so to speak, a shadow of a man a shadow of a king, that the king is the very image of God. And if you compare that to the New Testament, where Jesus is said to be, he didn't, I'm not in, it's in Philip, what do you say, in the letter to the Philippians, I don't know, but where Jesus is emptying himself, and he's going, there's this, he's not treating his likeness to God as a pressure or something like that, but it's like, there's a humility in God, as you said. And what I want to come to is the theology of the cross, and how God is actually not, it seems, alien to all the, as we would say, ugly aspects of the world, but somehow present to it and transformed to it. And so how in the line of this reflection, I want, because the natural world is also sometimes violent, and it needs to be healed and so on. So there is an aspect of the natural world and the created world which doesn't quite live up to our notion of beauty and goodness always. But there is I would like you to reflect on what's God's relationship to those, so to speak, shadow sides of creation and human experience.
Who shall we pass the question?
Well, Andrew can begin.
Okay, so I'll give you some brief answers to this then, because we need to start drawing to close soon. But please go ahead, Andrew.
Okay, this is quite a complicated set of issues, but I'll mention briefly Charles Darwin. Now, Charles Darwin, he grew up in a country where Christians had lived for 2,000 years, more or less, and we cultivated the English countryside. Much of our countryside looks very beautiful. And I think it was a cultural shock when he went to the jungles of Brazil and Latin America, because nature was more raw. And there's a phrase that comes out of that work, nature red in tooth and claw. So yes, I think you're right. The world presents an ambiguous face, and we shouldn't be naive about that. I also think that Christian societies over long periods can enhance the beauty of nature. And I noticed in my country, many people go to Italy for holidays, because central Italy is very beautiful. But that's a place where religious people have lived and cultivated the land for many, many centuries. So I think the world is more ambiguous, but I do think that Christians over long periods, and this is quite radical today, because a lot of environmentalists say that human beings are like a disease on earth. And that's not the Christian vision. The Christian vision is that we're meant to cultivate the garden, and we're meant to help plants and animals to flourish in more ordered ways that perhaps will be found in nature. So, so for Darwin, it was a shock to go from England to Brazil. And I completely agree with you that nature looks ambiguous, but we collectively can cultivate and enhance and make more clear many of the beauties of nature. I don't think I've got anything else positive to say about that. We're meant to be gardeners, not just machine makers.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. I think probably we need to draw to close there, unless Petra or Josefin, you would like to make a brief statement? No? Okay. Well, then I think we should thank our main speaker, Andrew Pinsent, and the panel, Petra Carlsson, Josefin Holmström, Paul Hemeren.
Thank you. And thank you, panelists. Bye-bye.
So this has been a joint effort by Sigtuna Foundation and the Swedish Network for Christians in Academia. We hope to offer more opportunities for these kind of dialogues in the future. So thank you all for attending, and see you hopefully soon.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.